Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannon. This video is going to be about debunking atheism, and it's volume 1. Now, when you argue with atheists, non-believers, people who don't believe in God, there are some important things you have to keep in mind. Important points about God that if you don't remember and use in your arguments, it can get you into a lot of trouble. So one of the first things you got to remember about God is that God is uncaused. Now, what that means is that God is not created by anything. God did not create himself. God has always been. There is no explanation for God's existence. God simply is. God is uncaused, meaning nothing caused God. Because God is uncaused, then another thing you have to remember about God is that God is not made of parts, or God has divine simplicity. What this concept means is that God is not made of physical reality, because all physical reality is made of parts. God is mysterious, but certainly God is not made of parts. If something is made of parts, it's caused by those parts. Because God is uncaused, God cannot be made of parts. And God has to be uncaused, because if God was caused or made of parts, then there would be something greater than God, and there would be something that caused God or created God. And then one could ask, well, what created God? So, remembering that God is uncaused and God is not made of parts avoids the whole atheistic trap of claiming that God must be caused by another God or something else. A third thing to remember is that God is not the universe. God creates the universe, creates physical reality, but God is separate from the universe. The universe is made of parts. There's parts everywhere we look. That means that the universe is caused by those parts. God is uncaused. God is not made of parts. God cannot be the universe. The universe cannot be part of God because God doesn't have parts. So you can't claim something as a part of God. God creates the universe. God is ever present in the universe, controls the universe, has power over the universe. But the universe is a created thing. It's not God. A fourth thing you should remember is that God does not perform magic. God uses his uncaused power to create physical reality, to act on physical reality, to do things in our world. God does not use magic. Pure magic is doing something which has no cause. Uh, it's essentially something from nothing. God doesn't do that. God actually has an uncaused power that God must use to do things. So God is not a magician. Uh, God is mysterious. God being an uncaused being, not made of parts, is completely mysterious and incomprehensible to human beings who are made from physical reality. There is no way to understand an uncaused being, specifically from that being's perspective. God is mysterious. God is necessarily real. That's why we believe in God. But God is still mysterious. Uh, God is also timeless. God creates physical reality, including time. Time is part of physical reality, it's part of space time. Time is a real dimension of physical reality. However, because God creates time, God cannot be subject to time. God is not in our time. He's not subject to time. God doesn't have his own time. God is outside of time itself. God creates time. He can't be subject to time. If he was subject to time, he'd be subject to the thing he created, uh, which is impossible because time would have to exist before he did for him to exist, which is an impossibility. So that involves impossibility, and it just doesn't make any sense at all. And because God doesn't have any parts, again, anything with parts is subject to time. God has no parts, so he cannot be subject to time. So uh, when thinking about God, you have to remember that you're dealing with a timeless being whose perspective is not temporal. God doesn't think like human beings do in a temporal fashion, uh, from yesterday to today to tomorrow, that sort of progression. God is not subject to time, doesn't have that progression. Uh, God already knows everything there is to know. He can't learn something new because he already knows everything. But understand, God is outside of time. That's very mysterious and very different than a human being and a human's consciousness. But important to remember that. Also, another thing, science is not the enemy, but science has limitations. Um, in our society, we seem to think that science has no limits on the questions that it is capable of answering. It's just a matter of waiting long enough before some brilliant scientist discovers the answer to some conundrum or question. Well, that's not true, actually. Science does have a limit. And the most basic limit of science is that science and scientific instruments and scientists cannot leave the universe. They're physically incapable of leaving the universe. There's no way to do it. The principle of conservation of energy and mass, which is a law of physics, says that matter, energy, mass in the form of scientists or scientific instruments literally cannot leave the universe, because if it did, that energy, mass, and matter would disappear from the universe, and that would be a violation of the principle of conservation of energy and mass. So there is no way for science to leave the universe and gather data to present proofs about the cause of the universe or physical reality or the cause of the cosmos. It's a limit. So when where you're talking about God, you're talking about the being responsible for the creation of physical reality, a metaphysical being, a being beyond physical reality. So you're talking about fundamental questions about the creation of the cosmos, the universe, physical reality itself. And this is a question science can never answer. Never. It's not a question of we just don't know yet, or if you wait around long enough, you might find out. No, science cannot definitively ever answer the questions about why physical reality exists, because science can't leave the universe in order to do that. And even if it could leave the universe, that doesn't mean it would get the answer anyway. But it can't leave the universe. So ultimately, on the question of the existence of God, the appropriate method of determining truth is philosophical. It's using philosophical metaphysics, using logic and reasoning to make reasonable inferences and deductions and proofs regarding the existence of God, because science can't go there. Science has no ability to prove answers to these questions. Very important thing to keep in mind, because atheists, non-believers, will often try to claim that science will give us the answers if you wait long enough, and you don't need a God. And that's just not true. They simply do not accept that science has a limit when it clearly does. Okay, so that's just sort of a 7 things I thought you really need to keep in mind when you're talking to atheists or non-believers and discussing the issue of whether God exists or not. For the rest of this video, I'm going to present 2 atheistic arguments, and then I'm going to show you how to get out of them and what's wrong with them. Now, atheistic arguments really come in 2 varieties. One variety is soft, and the other variety is hard. Now, the soft arguments usually are focused on human culture, or they're emotional arguments. Um, they can be very effective, uh, but they're not as intellectually challenging, generally speaking, as the harder arguments. And the hard atheist arguments usually involve science and philosophy. So the 2 arguments I'm going to go over today, these are some of the hardest philosophical arguments against the existence of God. So I'm starting off uh, Debunking Atheism, Volume 1, with pretty much the hardest arguments you're ever going to come up against. And these are complicated arguments, they really are, to understand. But you'll get to understand them and understand how to get out of them. Otherwise, you can get trapped by them. The first atheistic argument is that God must be subject to time. And because God acts in time, then time itself must be greater than God, which proves that God is caused by time and is caused by space-time, and therefore can't be a supreme being, and therefore doesn't exist, because God not being a supreme being is the opposite of what God needs to be in order to be God, and therefore can't be God, so God doesn't exist. A spin on this particular argument is you may hear non-believers say, well, uh, I don't mind a God so long as that God doesn't actively interfere in the workings of the universe. And some Christians might go along with that statement because it preserves the idea of God, at least in their minds. It just says that, well, God created the universe, but the universe does everything on its own after that. God basically started it once and then left it, and now it just goes on its own merry way. Well, that's really a trap argument as well, because if the universe is going on its own way, then God's not controlling it. Then that means something else is controlling it that's not God. So that means the universe has its own foundation for independent reality, its own independence of existence outside of God. So then you have the problem of, well, if the universe can exist without there being a God, even if the God is the one who started it, then what do you need the God for? Why don't you just say the universe always existed? You don't need a God. See, it can independently exist on its own. So be careful of those sorts of arguments. They ultimately lead to atheism. Now, God has to have control over the universe. God has to have the ability to interact in the universe and do things in the universe. God simply cannot just create the universe and walk away. That's no God at all. So God has to be able to intervene in the universe and control the universe at any time in the universe in order for God to be God. Um, but the atheist will say, well, that's impossible because if God intervened in the universe, then that would make God subject to time. And their explanation will be this, that because God acts to sustain the universe at every moment, then that means God is acting. He's acting with his creational powers at every moment of time, which means that God's acts must also occur in every moment of time, which means that God is acting in time, which means that God is subject to time. And of course, if God is subject to time, then time is greater than God. Then something greater than God exists, then that means God is not God. And as I just got done explaining to you earlier, God is timeless, not subject to time. So many Christians will accept this argument that because God's volitional, creational act to sustain the universe through time means that God must be acting in time, and therefore God's acts cannot be separated from time, meaning God must be subject to time. That means God is subject to time, and that means God isn't God, so we're going to agree with you and say that God doesn't act in time, he just creates the universe once, and then walks away. All right? But again, I already explained to you, that's not a good That's not a good answer either. So you need a good answer to this question. How is it that God can act at every moment of the universe, at least in the form of sustaining its existence, and yet not himself be subject to time? So how is this possible? The answer is that God creates each moment of time in a timeless fashion, and that each moment of time is a timeless frame in a film that rolls along in which we experience as time, but that there is no time in between frames, and that each frame itself is an indivisible unit of space time or reality. So the answer to this first atheist objection is that God uses indivisible units of space time. Now, this is a difficult concept, and I'll try to simplify it for you as best I can. There's two general notions of the physical reality of the universe. One is that it's continuous, and the other is that it's discrete. Now, in physics, the Einstein's theory of general relativity assumes that space-time is continuous. Well, there's another theory called quantum mechanics, which has to do with the smallest things in the universe, whereas general relativity has to do with the largest things in the universe, the macro scale versus the micro scale. And in quantum mechanics, it's about quanta, or discreteness, or indivisible units. Now, these two theories, general relativity and quantum mechanics, haven't been reconciled. There's been attempts over many, many decades to try to reconcile these two irreconcilable theories. So even though both theories on their own accurately predict either the macro or the micro scale, neither one can predict the other scale. So we know that there's something wrong with both of these theories because we don't have a unified theory of reality. And physicists are constantly trying to devise a unified theory of reality, or something called the theory of everything. So this is still up in the air and being debated, the grand theory of everything. One possibility is something called quantum gravity. And quantum gravity includes in its hypothesis the existence of indivisible units of space time, the very thing that I'm talking about here. And interestingly enough, there was a study done just a couple of years ago that showed that if there was an indivisible unit of space time, that as the universe expanded, it would take away a very minuscule amount of energy as it expanded at the smallest level of reality. But compounded over time in the great expansion of the universe, this loss of energy would equal the dark energy that physicists are currently looking for. So this indivisible unit of space-time would present a solution to the mystery of dark energy itself. So there's reason to believe that this indivisible unit of space-time is real and not just a theory. Okay, so we have basically continuous and discrete. In the continuous realm, space doesn't have an indivisible unit of reality. There's no smallest unit of space-time. The further you look, it just continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and you never see any graininess to it or some sort of indication that it's made of stuff. It's simply smooth. Discreteness, when you get down small enough, you'll start to see this graininess, and eventually you'll reach the indivisible unit of space-time that all space-time is made out of. Now, understand that this distance at what I'm talking about, going down to smaller and smaller detail, the size of an indivisible unit of space-time, if it existed, is so small that nobody can see it at this point. There's no microscope or particle accelerator or anything that can prove that something exists at such minute scales. I mean, we're talking about close to the Planck scale, so it's like 10 to the negative 33. So this is really small stuff. So nobody knows exactly what's down there, but there's definitely a case to be made that there's an indivisible unit of space-time. Now, that is a big deal if there is an indivisible unit of space-time. And the reason is because if it's not continuous, then we can explain how God can create physical reality without himself subjecting himself to time. And I'll show you how that's done. So instead of a continuous space-time, we're talking about a space-time that is made of indivisible units of space-time. So you can think of it this way. This would be continuous. So space-time just is a continuity. Doesn't matter how far down you look, how far you divide it, it will always be continuous. It's a continuous thing. Whereas with indivisible units of space-time, at a very small Planck size, it appears to be continuous, but if you get down small enough, you'll notice that it's actually made of indivisible units. So instead of just a straight line like that, it's actually basically units of space-time, but extraordinarily small units that you can't see. At least now we can't see them. And why is this important? Well, because in order for God to act outside of time and create physical reality and not subject himself to time by doing so, each of his creational volitional acts is essentially the appearance of an indivisible unit of space-time. So God makes this one appear, then he makes that one appear, then he makes that one appear, then he makes that one appear. And it's that series of the appearance, disappearance, reappearance of these indivisible units of space-time is what we experience as time. It's time itself. That is what time is. But an indivisible unit of space-time is not itself subject to time because it creates time. This is time. This series of appearances and disappearances of these indivisible units. That's what time is. Each particular unit, however, is not time. It's not subject to time. It's what is creating time. And God is what makes this thing appear and then disappear. So there is no time that it takes for it to appear and disappear because time doesn't exist at this level. It simply appears and disappears. And we think of that appearance and disappearance as a unit of time, such as 10 to the negative 33 or Planck time. But it's not actually time itself. It's just a unit that creates time. But it's an individual unit of space-time. So it's not just these dots aren't just time. They're also space-time or physical reality or energy and mass and matter and everything. But it's an indivisible unit, and it's a unit that appears and disappears, but not in the context of time, not in the framework of time, because it's what is creating time as a series goes by. So it doesn't require time for it to appear or disappear. It's a timeless thing. The appearance itself is timeless. It's done in a timeless fashion. And therefore, because God makes these things appear in a timeless fashion, God is not subjecting himself to time because he's creating something in a timeless fashion that as the series progresses, it appears to us as time, but it does not subject God to time. There is no time in between the appearances of these indivisible units of reality. So each appearance is an independent event that occurs outside of time. But the accumulation of these events as a series is what we experience as space, time, and reality. So this indivisible unit of space-time means that when God acts to make this indivisible unit appear, he's not doing it in time. It's outside of time. So even though it appears like these things are going like this, that doesn't mean God is acting in time in order to do that, because these are timeless, indivisible units. Now, this is some very complicated stuff to understand, but it is the way to get out of this atheistic argument. Now, to give you an analogy, for instance, the photon, which is a particle of light, under general relativity, is considered a timeless particle. However, we also know that a photon can appear and disappear. It can be emitted from an atom and absorbed by an atom. But you're talking about a timeless particle that also has the ability to appear and disappear. So this, by analogy only, all right? By analogy, there is precedence for this idea that something can appear and disappear and yet still be timeless, because that is supposedly exactly what the photon does. Now, I'm using the photon as an analogy. The photon is a bigger particle, and it itself is made of things. So it's different than these things that I'm talking about. But as an analogy, in physics, the idea of something appearing and disappearing without being subject to time uh, has precedence in the photon itself. Okay, so this is how you get out of the first atheistic argument. God creates the universe. He uses um, uh, indivisible units of space-time that are themselves timeless. The appearance of these particles does not occur in time. They are, in fact, what creates time. So God is acting in a timeless fashion to create time. So you can't say that God's continuous creation throughout time subjects God to time, because it doesn't, because there is no time in between the appearance and disappearance of each of these indivisible units of space-time. Okay, on to the second hard atheistic argument. Now, the good news for you is I'm giving you pretty much the hardest atheistic arguments there are. So once you get past these, it's all downhill from here, except for the problem of evil. But I'll get to that eventually. There's an answer to that, too. So, a second atheistic argument, a very hard atheistic argument, is well, everything in physical reality is caused by some sort of force that acts upon it, by some other physical reality. So if you want to say that you exist in physical reality, you got to talk about forces. What force is applying itself in physical reality for this to occur, to be caused in physical reality? So the atheist will say, well, look, God is immaterial. Uh, so how does an immaterial being apply a physical force in physical reality such that we could believe that his existence is possible? Because if he's immaterial, how could he have any effect on physical reality whatsoever? He doesn't appear to have the ability to exert a physical force. So if he doesn't influence the universe in some way or have the ability to do so, then why should we believe he exists? Okay, well, that's a good question. Um, so God is immaterial. That's true. God is not made of physical reality. He's not made of parts. So how is it that God has an influence on physical reality? And the answer is this, that as I just explained, God causes, in a metaphysical sense, the appearance of an indivisible unit of space-time. And then he makes it disappear, and then he makes it reappear. And this sequence of appearances and disappearances, which are not in time themselves, is how God creates physical reality. It's the creation of the forces in physical reality that God is doing. So the question is then, well, how does God make this indivisible unit of space-time appear? How does God do that? Well, there's a big problem with asking that question. And it's you're asking a question that is outside the framework of space-time itself. You're talking about an indivisible unit of space-time and the appearance of that, which creates space-time. So it's not subject to time itself. So you're not really talking about physical causation. You're not talking about what we generally think of as causation, that is, causation in physical reality, because it doesn't involve space time. You're really talking about metaphysical causation or logical causation. That is to say, this couldn't occur unless God were real. So that's a fundamental problem right there. If you're asking the question, well, how does God cause the appearance of these indivisible units of physical reality? You got to understand that that causation you have in your mind is the wrong one. It's not physical causation; it's metaphysical causation or logical causation. So then you ask the question, well, how does God do that then? All right, how does He do that? Now the problem with that is God is uncaused. Something that is uncaused requires no explanation. Essentially, when you ask for an explanation, you're asking for its cause. What caused it to happen? What caused it to be? When you're dealing with something that's uncaused, it doesn't have a causation for its own existence. It doesn't have an explanation for its existence. There's nothing that caused it to exist. So, because God is uncaused, God has no explanation. So, asking the question, well, how does God cause an indivisible unit of physical reality to appear from just to appear, is to ask an impossible question, because there is no explanation. You're asking for a causal explanation for an uncaused being with the power to do this. So, because God's uncaused, there is no explanation by definition, because God is uncaused. There's no explanation for that happening, because God is uncaused. So ultimately, the answer to this question, this atheistic problem of how does God interact with physical reality, is that A, God acts timelessly through indivisible units of space-time, which creates space-time and forces in time, and B, the appearance of such things as indivisible units of space-time can't be explained because it's an uncaused power God is using, which has no explanation by definition because it's uncaused. Uncaused things have no explanation. Ultimately, the second atheistic objection is really just assuming God is a physical reality and has a physical cause, and that's an non sequitur or nonsensical question to ask. Non sequitur, meaning nonsensical, nonsense. You're missing something important. And that's essentially the answer to this second atheistic objection. You can also understand this in the terms of circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. It means that you can't assume the existence of the thing that you're trying to prove. That's not a proof. So every proof, when you're proving a thing, the premises of that proof cannot include the thing that you're trying to prove. That's not a proof. That's called circular reasoning fallacy. So when you talk about physical causation, God is the cause of causation itself. So asking how God causes something assumes the existence of causation, when causation hasn't even been created yet, because God hasn't created it. So it's assuming the existence of something, but God hasn't created it yet. So that's circular reasoning. So you can't ask the question, how does God physically cause forces in the universe? Because physical causation doesn't exist in God's realm. God doesn't act through physical causation. God causes physical causation. Okay, those are two of the hardest atheistic arguments, philosophical arguments that you're ever going to run across. And trust me, there is a way to debunk every atheistic objection and argument, provided you know how to do it. And I hope you learned something today on how to go about debunking these atheistic objections. There's a lot of atheistic objections. There's dozens and dozens of them, and they're always thinking up new ones. But trust me, there's always a way to counter them. It may not be readily apparent to you, but there is. And watching these videos will help you in learning how to debunk atheism on your own. All right. If you have any questions or comments, leave it below. And I appreciate you watching.